Well, I would say on Hoop Dreams, I learned a lot. That was the first real film. And among the things that I think I learned was, one of the things I learned right away was when we were starting out to do the film, I think I was more inclined at the beginning to want to do interviews where people would tell us about what's going on with themselves and their lives and whatever, sort of get that information through interviews. And my partner on the film, Peter Gilbert, had just been working with Barbara Kopple on American Dream extensively. And so he came to the project. We were so fortunate to have Peter shoot the film, that he came to the project in that mindset of like, okay, how can things be scenes, not interviews? So he really kind of pushed me early to start thinking in that way, to think in terms of scenes and not interviews, to convey things. Not that you fabricate scenes, but that you look to see what's going on in people's lives that you can then capture, that says much of what you would get from the interview. So that was a really important early lesson. And then I think another lesson I learned on that film fairly early on, about a year or so into it actually, was when the boys first went out to St. Joseph High School, this Catholic suburban powerhouse school. The school was accepting of us to film, but they said, Coach Pingatore, said, it's going to be tough to film in the classrooms for a while. I mean, it's, the school's nervous about that. It's fine for you to film in practice, all that, no problem, I control that. But in the classroom is tough, so may have to ease into that. And I was like, sure, no problem. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, they're going to be out here for 4 years, so there's no rush to film that. So the whole first year, their freshman year that they were in school there, we did not film in the classrooms, sort of honoring that concern. And then sophomore year rolled around, and near the beginning of sophomore year, Arthur was kicked out of the school. And as it turns out, we had no footage of him in a classroom in St. Joe's. And when we got to editing, that proved to be quite a challenge, was how can we give as strong of impression of him having been out there as possible, even though you don't see a single frame of him in class. We fortunately had an interview of him outside of the school wearing a nice sweater. We had him in basketball practice, and we had him talking about the school. But if you go back and look at the movie right now, there's not a single image of him in the school. And most people would probably say, really? I don't recall that. So the important lesson there was, never assume that a situation is going to remain. If it's important, get it. Don't wait. Now, they said they had concerns. I'm sure we could have gotten in there before the end of freshman year if we just said, just let us work it out. So I've learned that lesson. I've had to relearn that lesson sometimes, but you tend to think, oh, this is not that crucial right now, or I can get it later. Don't make that mistake. And sometimes it drives your crew crazy because you've had a long day and there's something that you just feel like you better get now because you never know, and they were like, but you do it anyway. So that's an important lesson. With Stevie, the next documentary that was also a long in the making film, I think the big lesson from that film was, that film was about, the main subject in that film is someone who is not nearly as sympathetic as Arthur and William were from Hoop Dreams. He was a kid I was a big brother to. When I made the film, he was 24. He was arrested and charged with, a sex crime against a minor, his niece. He himself is, he's just not as sympathetic a person. He's gruff. He can say really awful things. He can turn around and be sweet too, but he was a much more unlikable person in every respect than Arthur and William to have as your main subject in a movie, in a documentary. And one of the things I think I learned on that film, not just about Stevie, but also his family, who were quite troubled, particularly his mother and his grandmother, is that it's important in a documentary to discourage on the part of viewers this tendency I think we all have is to make judgments, quick, easy judgments about people. We do it in real life all the time. In a movie, I think it's even easier because you're sitting there in the dark, you're watching someone's life unfold, and you get to sit there in judgment very easily. Now, when it's fiction, you know, the stakes aren't nearly so high. If you want to judge, you know, Tony Soprano in The Sopranos harshly, go right ahead. You know, what's the real loss there? But when it's real people, I think the responsibility is far greater. So in the case of Stevie and some of his family members, one of the things I learned on that film is that I had to really work to have the film remain honest and true and not whitewash Stevie or apologize for his crimes, but also try to get the viewer to come to understand how the Stevies of the world come to be in a place that they are. Because there's nothing more vilified in American society than a pedophile. I mean, we think of murderers in a better light than we do pedophiles. So that was a real challenge on that film. I do feel like I succeeded, but the film took 7 years to make, and it was quite a journey of both in the making and the filming and then in the editing to try and create a portrait that achieved that. So I did this film called No Crossover, The Trial of Allen Iverson, which was a film about a controversial American basketball player, star. He's retired not too long ago officially. But for years he was considered quite a divisive athlete in American society. I did a film about when he was in high school. He actually came from my hometown. He was involved in a racial bowling alley brawl that was the beginning of his reputation as this divisive athlete. And I went back to try to understand how this brawl had so divided my hometown and led to this sort of place for Allen Iverson in our culture. So one of the things that I decided, because we were going to be talking about race in a very overt way, one of the things I learned is that African Americans, generally speaking, are much more comfortable talking about race than white people. Why? I think it has to do with the fact that race has occupied such a central place in their lives for hundreds of years, and still does. And they think about it, and they have a lot to say about it. Whereas white people have a tendency to not want to talk about race at all, for fear of appearing racist, especially not candidly. So one of the things I learned was, when I went down to film with black subjects, or really liberal whites, if I knew they were really liberal, it was fine to have a black cameraman to shoot that footage. And I chose this particular cameraman who I'd worked with before because he was actually a really great, thoughtful person on the issue of race himself and contributed mightily to the film creatively beyond just filming it. He would, as a black man, challenge black interview subjects on topics, which was really great, because it's one thing for me to ask a challenging question, it's another for him. So that was great. But I realized that if I took him to certain interviews with white subjects, it would only hinder their ability to speak candidly. So I made separate trips down to my hometown without him, and he knew. I told him I was doing this, but I didn't go behind his back. I just said, Keith, I can't take you down for these interviews for this reason. And he said, absolutely, totally get it. So I took a white shooter, Dana Cupper, who I've worked with many years and continue to work with, and she shot those interviews. And that ended up being a smart choice because it allowed the white subjects to feel more free to express themselves candidly. So With this new film about Roger Ebert, Life Itself, Roger, in the last years of his life, had a medical condition. He suffered through various bouts of cancer that caused his face to be disfigured, for him to lose his ability to speak, and for to eat as well. And when he would go out in public bravely, he would wear a turtleneck, black turtleneck under his sport coat, or he'd wear a scarf. And I didn't realize all those times that I saw him publicly that the turtleneck was quite strategic. It was to block the fact that he had a hole through the back of his jaw. There was nothing here at all. So when we started the film, I remember the first day when we were filming with him, and he was wearing a white bandage, which is what he typically wore. It was quite pronounced that you could see right through his jaw. And when I came into the hospital room, he was asleep and his jaw was hanging way down. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, is anyone going to want to watch this, see this? Because it was very hard to look at. But I filmed it anyway, because I felt like it was important to film it. And then he woke up, and when he woke up, and this shot is actually in the film, he woke up, his eyes sort of lit up at seeing us there to film, and he smiled, and I was relieved that it would probably work out. But one of the things we decided to do is we decided that we were going to really put it right in your face right away what the physical reality of life was for him, both the jaw that I've described, but also the medical procedures that he would go through routinely, which is like having his throat his windpipe suctioned, which when you see this in the film, it's a very hard sequence to look at. You see the profound pain that he goes through, and it's something that he does several times a day. I wanted to make sure that the audience saw all that up front, so that they could kind of deal with their horror at times maybe, or their discomfort at all of this, with the hopes that they would then get past it and see Roger for who he really was, which is he's Roger Ebert. And he, of course, has this that he has to struggle with, but he's still that guy that we all who knew Roger came to know and love in some way. And I think that every film, this will be my final lesson, it sort of takes in every film I've done. Every film that I've done, I feel like for me personally, the film itself becomes a distillation of the discovery and the process that I go through as a filmmaker in making the film over sometimes many years. And by that I mean, whatever has surprised me, whatever my stereotypes were about someone that when I met them, like Tanya, Stevie's girlfriend, and Stevie, or the horror of seeing, Roger's disfigurement so vividly, that whatever I encounter and I realize hit me and surprise me or worry me or feels threatening to me or confuses me, though I try to maintain that same sort of journey for the viewer in watching the movie. In The Interrupters, we put a lot of violent, disturbing stuff near the beginning of the movie because it does knock you back on your heels and make you think, oh my God, where am I and this is a terrible situation. And then the rest of the movie is about helping you understand and humanize the people who live in those neighborhoods, which was the journey that we went on as filmmakers as well. So I feel like it's important to me as a filmmaker, and I think it's maybe a good lesson for other filmmakers, is that you want to maintain that journey and distill it into your films, because that's what makes it more truthful, and it makes it more inherently dramatic as well.